Thanks. So maybe the outline for this talk could be something along these lines, which is law is America's operating system. It's this fabric that ties individuals and companies together, affecting everybody's actions and affecting folks around the world too. So the way that we think of it at Ravel is that that operating system needs a major upgrade. It needs a new interface. It needs a new way of looking at this information and extracting value from it and helping practitioners and general citizens interact with it. And the way that we're working with it is from a very lawyer-centric perspective. As you mentioned in the intro, I'm a graduate of Stanford Law School. I come from a family of lawyers, so both parents are attorneys. An older brother is a lawyer, a younger brother is a second-year student at Stanford Law School. So there's definitely a genetic defect in my family, but it's not a genetic defect around technical expertise. That's not where the idea of Ravel started. It started from a perspective from people who are interacting with the law day in and day out. What are some of the challenges in working with this information, and what are some of the opportunities to take advantage of it that haven't been exploited yet? The rest of our team, though, is a really interesting combination of lawyers, engineers, and designers all working together. And so for this talk and thinking about how do you take legal information and turn it into a business, turn it into a product, we've felt it's really important to approach it from those three different perspectives. The data science doesn't exist in a vacuum. The legal expertise doesn't exist in a vacuum. And understanding how lawyers or general citizens are going to use this material or product day in and day out requires this combination that's really important, but rather difficult to put together. So as a team, we're building this new era of analytics. Think of it as taking legal information and building a whole new set of interfaces and analysis on top of it that helps people sift through millions and millions of documents to find what's important and understand why it's important, and to have a data-driven perspective about how they could use legal information more persuasively and more effectively. The other challenge that's really worth talking about here is where does this data actually come from? How do you get legal data as the core building block of building all of these other things? When we started Ravel about 4 years ago, we looked around the world, looked around the country, and saw that government was becoming more transparent. Access to court and legal information was becoming more transparent and publicly available in machine-readable formats. But it wasn't totally there yet. It was still a patchwork. And as you look around the country to different states, different cities, one of the challenges is definitely getting your hands on enough data or enough trustworthy data or a comprehensive set of data so that the things you build from it have credibility. So what we've done is actually form a partnership with Harvard Law School to digitize our entire collection of case law, which covers every federal and state court decision going back to the beginning of time for all of those courts. It's a really extraordinary collection, rivaled maybe only by the Library of Congress. And it includes about 45,000 books that have been sitting on Harvard's shelves in their archives, gathering dust that Harvard was excited about bringing into the digital age, and that we were excited about bringing into the digital age too, so that we could build things on top of it. So one of the places that we could go with this talk, but I won't, is just to say that we're actually starting to make this data available to other people too. And so if you're interested in thinking about legal information and building things from it, you should be in touch with us, because we have this collection now that we're making available to the world. New York and California's collection of case law are already fully digitized and live in our system, and so we're starting to work with that. So one of the places that we started with this, of thinking about how do you take a new view on legal data and what does it mean to build a business around it, was from these different perspectives. The one that I had experienced most firsthand was this 35% of attorney time is spent on research. And you can't imagine how sort of horrible those hours are. It's sifting through millions and millions of documents, trying to cull together different pieces of information to make an argument. And it's trying to figure out how a judge may rule on a certain case or in a certain type of topic. Because of that work is so time consuming, we felt there was a real opportunity. And there was an opportunity not just because it was time consuming, because it was really unloved work. and young attorneys who have to do this kind of thing are the unhappiest workers in America, according to Forbes, which is the group that was right after that, sort of second less unhappy, was call center workers. So that kind of puts it in perspective of how unhappy these lawyers are. And then as we started to interact with firms and our customers, we learned this additional perspective, which is that they're writing off about $60,000 a year in attorney time that's being spent on research that their clients won't pay for. So that adds up when you're looking at even a relatively small firm to millions and millions of dollars a year. And the optimistic piece of this, though, was, yeah, sorry.
Do you know what's the population of junior attorney in USA? The population.
The population?
Yeah.
I don't have an exact number, but it's probably 75 to 100,000, something like that.
I'm trying to get the sense of market size.
Yeah. So those are some of the downers about this space and some of the things that make people interested in new products in the legal world. But the optimistic perspective, too, is that there's the ability to take technology and turn this into something more powerful, not just to save time, but to give people better insights about how the law works and how they can take advantage of it. So a lot of what we're doing has relied on technology, and I'm not the best person to speak about it. The person who is Jeremy Corbett, sitting right here, who will be giving a talk at 1:10, which you should definitely go to. And so he'll talk about the stack that we're using and how we're taking millions of documents and processing them and extracting and classifying information. But if you think about what we're trying to do, the changes that have happened in the last 10 years of the ability to use the cloud, ability to use technologies like Spark, the developments in machine learning, even just 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to do what we're doing today. And so a lot of it is pushing the envelope pretty hard. But it's sort of our belief that when you take machine learning and apply it in a very specific way to a specific challenge, you can get really good, powerful results. And so we're not trying to use it in a Watson type way. We're trying to tailor it in a very supervised, trained way to specific tasks, and I can give you some examples of that. The other thing that resonated with us was combining data science with how do you actually present that information? How do you take the insights that you can gather and make them accessible to whatever the audience is? And in our case, lawyers are not the most technologically savvy people. So the thing that got us interested in how you access this information is the idea that search is really still in its infancy. And the 10 blue links that you get from Google would be the first to tell you that that's not the right approach for every kind of research problem. And so here are some examples of the nuances in search that you've seen everywhere else in shopping and finding a restaurant and searching for flights. And the unique challenge in the legal world was how do you take 20 or 30 or 40 different pieces of information that may be scattered across different courts, that may be scattered across 50 or 100 years worth of history, and tie them together and take bits and pieces of each of them so that you finally have an answer. And so we use a lot of data visualization as a tool to take statistics, to take network relationships, to take insights and try to turn it into something that's really easily digestible and really actionable. The other unique thing about the law is that oftentimes it's talked about as an art, not a science. And you hear that in law school almost from day one. Being a lawyer is an art, not a science. And that's true, but it's not the entire truth. So there are elements that it's a professional skill and it requires expertise. But for a long time, lawyers have not recognized the opportunities to take advantage of technology in new ways and to take a bit more data-driven and a more scientific approach. And we have confidence that that's changing in the legal profession because of what we've seen in some other industries that had that same mentality, that what they do is an art, not a science. So two of the really interesting examples are pro sports, where you had this happen in baseball, where people who believed that you could only evaluate talent with human skills were quickly, sort of in the 2000s, replaced or augmented by an approach that used data to look at players, develop new game strategies. And in the early days, it was a really fierce battle between the people who believed you could only do it with human eyes and the people who believed you should use it with data. But today, that debate is no longer really a debate. It's been resolved. And the answer is you need to strike the right balance between those two things. So what we're trying to do in the law is strike that balance and say, how do you use technology to augment the skills of lawyers or of general citizens to understand information, not to provide a black box answer that isn't really reportable on, you can't see the underlying rationale. And the other interesting place that this has obviously happened is in political campaigns, where for many, many years they were driven by pundits who would stick their finger in the air and take a rather unscientific approach to understanding how people would vote and how to get out the vote. And most observers would credit the Obama campaign's use of technology for their win in 2012. And so these are lawyers are oftentimes big baseball fans and they're political junkies, so these are things that resonate with them too, which is good. Maybe the one kernel I want to talk about here, and maybe you can think about as a takeaway from this talk, would be that we're really entering in the law a new era of asymmetric analytics. And you may have heard of asymmetric information. It's an economic idea that when two people have different information, one side ends up with an advantage. And the example would be used car salespeople. They have information about a car that the buyer doesn't have. And that creates arbitrage opportunities. It creates all sorts of things. And for a long time in the law, that was the case. You'd have differences in the information available to people, whether it hadn't existed in digital format yet and they went out and found it, or they had different tools. What we're seeing as government has made information more available, and we're sort of part of that effort, is that you have a leveling of the playing field when it comes to data, and now the advantages are to be found through the analytics and the interfaces on top of that. And so those who have the best of those tools will have the best advantage. So this is what we mean when we talk about using AI and machine learning and NLP on these documents. It's taking a case like Citizens United and running it through a system where we're starting to extract and classify bits and pieces of it. So it's identifying the lawyers and the companies and the judge that may be involved. It's identifying citations to other documents. It's classifying language of whether the case as a whole is about a certain motion type and what happened in that motion, whether it was granted or denied, whether the case was ultimately later reversed. And we do each of these bits with their own training data. So we have had a team of attorneys and linguists on site, internal at the company, creating this training data. Sometimes for certain of these tasks, hundreds of thousands of examples. And we'll create it, we'll train it, we'll look at the results, and we'll tweak and continue iterating. So it's sort of a continuous process of improvement until we're reaching scores that give us confidence that they're sort of as good as humans would be able to do it, or because we're doing something so new that nobody's ever done before, you could be 85% successful and it's still adding a lot of value. Here's something really specific, which is a challenging task in the law, and it's an interesting problem that's really important for lawyers, which is understanding when a case has been overturned before. So one of the famous examples is Plessy v. Ferguson, which said, separate facilities are equal, and it sort of embodied racial discrimination for a long time. And so when Brown v. Board came along, that case overturned that decision and said separate is not equal. And so the example of how you would do that with technology is to spot those relationships between the cases. And you may often use actually third cases that reference that relationship. So you'd have a third case observing what happened between Brown v. Board and Plessy v. Ferguson. And you can use that understanding and that observation to make a determination of whether Plessy v. Ferguson was overturned or not. You can also use information contained in Brown v. Board itself to make a determination. So you have to approach it from a variety of different angles. You have to deal with the nuances of how cases may talk about each other. And sometimes they'll use really clear-cut language saying we reverse or we overturn. And sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll say we distinguish or we criticize or this case is very different. So these are the kinds of problems that are really interesting and that we're working on that are challenging. And they don't get solved overnight. They require lots and lots of training data and iteration. And they require working with end users and customers to figure out what makes them comfortable that the technology is doing the job well. Here are a couple different examples of things that we've done. So here's an example of the search visualizations that we build when you run a search to take a traditional list but combine it with a citation network to show you relationships. Here's one of the notes that we got that was really sort of inspiring from an attorney who was using our system and wanted to renew. And he had embedded in his renewal notice an email that was a scan of a document he'd filed in court that used one of these visualizations to make his argument, saying that the law had changed, and here's how the visualization helped explain that. So it's been really rewarding to see these applications out in the field with Ravel being mentioned in case filings now and being used by lawyers in practice. Here's an example of a product that we've built that takes a case and breaks it down into a page-by-page understanding, looking at how each section of the document has been talked about by later decisions and highlighting the most relevant language that you can have a quick understanding of what's important about it. The last thing, maybe to leave you with a story, is about how some of this is new and how some of this is very old. So there's examples of lawyers doing this kind of in-depth analysis and spending hours and hours doing research to find an answer. And the story I like most is about Lyndon Johnson from his Senate campaign in 1948. He was running for the Senate in Texas, and he got caught up in accusations of voter fraud. And a judge issued an injunction keeping his name off the ballot, saying he wasn't going to be listed on the ballot until the accusations were cleared up. And with the election just a couple weeks away, he knew that he needed to get that injunction lifted, and he needed to get his name on the ballot. And both of those things needed to happen. It wasn't enough to win eventually 2 years from now. He needed to win really quickly. And so he assembled a team of lawyers. Nobody had a good answer for how to win fast enough that it mattered, except for one guy named Abe Fortas. And Abe said, look, there's only one chance we have here, which is to try to lose our appeal as quickly as possible so that we can then appeal to the Supreme Court, where I think it's more likely that they'll rule in our favor. So they sent a team of attorneys to where the circuit court was based, the appellate court, where they read through every decision written by the judges to find a judge who had ruled in a similar kind of appeal in the way that they wanted. And then they wrote the worst possible argument they could, got it submitted to this judge, and sure enough, within a couple hours, he ruled against them. And they took it to the Supreme Court, where they won, and Johnson's name went on the ballot. He ended up winning the election. Years later, when he was president, he appointed Abe Fortas to the Supreme Court. And so that kind of manual data analysis is now something that we can replicate in large part with a couple clicks using technology, which takes the knowledge that a really expert lawyer like an Abe Fortas would have and democratizes it across a bunch of different lawyers. Democratizes it back to those young attorneys who are looking for that knowledge and trying to build their skill set. So I'll leave you with that and open it up to questions too.
Do you also work on, we're parallel with the democracy conference, right? So do you also work on using NLP on like government bills that are sort of like cases, but aren't actually cases, but they're written in a legal way and they have legal ramifications that way?
Yeah, we've only started scratching the surface of that, of bringing in regulations and statutes because they're often linked to from the case law. So the legal system does have this multi-part analysis where it'll start with a statute, a law, but the law needs interpretation by the courts. And so you don't have a comprehensive picture of what the law means until you can look at the legal analysis from the court system too. So we found those interrelationships are important to our users, and they sort of enrich this graph of how things are related. So we've started to bring in the US code to our system and understand the linkages between cases, but we haven't focused all of our attention on that space yet. It's been a real sort of weighty challenge just to grapple with the case law so far.
Two questions. One, how do you make money? Two, how's this like? Are you ultimately trying to get to be what LexisNexis is?
So we make money through premium subscriptions to law firms. And firms are used to paying sometimes millions of dollars a year for Lexis and Westlaw products. And the way that we position it is as an additional tool to those existing conventional ways of doing research. We don't yet have a full functionality that can replace them, but we are resonating with the idea that this is an additional tool that goes above and beyond what they can do with other services. The piece that we like we like doing business with firms, obviously, but at the same time, we've felt like we can provide free search and access to the entire world too. So we make searching and reading for case law and Ravel free. Oh, sorry. So the question was, how do we make money, and do we eventually see ourselves as a replacement for Lexis? So where I was in the answer, sorry, was in thinking about these two parts of having a premium paid-for product as well as being able to democratize the information. It fits our thesis that the level playing field of information is sort of the business as usual right now, or it's where we wanted it to go. And so we'll make that basic information available to everybody and provide layers of analysis on top of it.
I like this idea of asymmetric analytics. I think that's a very curious sort of notion. I don't know if you came up with it, but I think it's interesting. The same application sort of tying together information in a case, I think it seems like you mentioned, that 10 links is not really the way to do everything, right? I mean, academic research. Geez, wouldn't it be neat if you were putting together, a neuroscience study, you could pull from where the correlates are and all these other. Have you tinkered with, in either your project or maybe seen other companies that do this, applications of a similar idea in other domains of information that really need deep research?
Yeah, so the question, if you didn't hear it, was, do we see applications in other spaces similar to what's happened in the law? It's a really great question. We get asked that a lot from folks in the medical space in particular, and in sort of scientific literature more broadly. In the medical space, there's not a whole lot going on, but there are companies that have been building out, and I'm not sure it's with technology, but they've been building out things to highlight the latest finding in an article and to tie that back to earlier research. But I think there's a really big opportunity to build similar kinds of search and analytics for, in particular, medical information, but I think there's other applications outside of that too. Maybe one more question? Last question?
One thing comes close to my mind is also pattern search. I think it's very similar, right? Now, do you get any customer testimony in terms of how much time really it saves, meaning how much it really speed up the work?
Yeah, so there were two questions. One is, are there applications in the patent world too? And there definitely are. There's a couple different companies doing things around the filing of patents and thinking about how you construct a patent. And then there's other companies that are focused on what happens in the litigation around patents. So we cover some of that, but not exclusively as our focus. And then,
Your real value in terms of
oh, sorry, yeah. So we've heard really phenomenal stories, actually, of attorneys calling us up and saying, thank you, last night I spent 2 hours looking for something in Lexis. I came into Ravel and found it in 2 minutes. So the savings can be really dramatic. Can't guarantee that always happens, but we've found that it does have moments like that where it's really transformational. Thanks.